What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, returning after a 5 or 6 year absence, is the one and only Robert Wright. That's right. It's Robert Wright. He is a New York Times bestselling author of The Evolution of God. Last time he was on the podcast, that's what we talked about. He has a brand new book out called Why Buddhism is True, the Science Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment. He also wrote The Moral Animal, Non-Zero, 3 Scientists and Their God. He is a co-founder, editor-in-chief of bloggingheads.tv, which, guess what? We're releasing this the same week I was on bloggingheads.tv. So you should go to the post for this or go to bloggingheads.tv. Let me let you guess what the URL is. You're right. It's bloggingheads.tv, and check out Robert interviewing me. Today I'm interviewing him, kind of. It's kind of a continuation of that conversation. And, so he started it, bloggingheads.tv. I love it. It was one of the inspirations for homebrewed Christianity 11 years ago. He has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, New York Times, Slate, Time, The New Republic. He's taught in psychology departments, religion departments, and currently he is visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Whoa. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But mostly why I'm excited he's on is it gives me a chance to tell you all, and he'll say it right at the beginning of this conversation, about the Mindful Resistance newsletter. You can check it out at mindfulresistance.net. And check out his work. I listen to almost all of his blogging head stuff, his meaningoflife.tv stuff. I love it. You'll hear have some rather similar takes on odd topics. So it was just a blast to talk to him. I've read all of his books, always admired his work. Think he's really thoughtful. And in the conversation, we're going to talk about politics, his time at Union, religion and science, consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, evolution, does it have a direction, purpose and things, the viability of a religious tradition, what's going on in religion and spirituality, rituals and such. We're going to talk about his proposal for a new type of agnosticism, which is different than the new atheist and old school agnosticism. We're just gonna have a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy it. Enough that you tell him and I to do it again, because it was fun. And we barely got in to my list of questions. So yeah. Before we hop in, just know that winter is coming on Homebrewed Christianity soon and very soon. We're going to be preparing for the launch of Game of Thrones final season with a back-to-back episodes in 1 week with Aaron from the Bald Move podcast collective. They have my favorite Game of Thrones podcast. And Anthony Ladon, who is a New Testament scholar and co-authored, I should say, with Aaron, Gods of Thrones, a 2-volume work on the religion of religions in Westeros, George R.R. Martin's universe in Game of Thrones. They're amazing books. They're fun. It's like super fan nerd stuff connected with things a religion scholar would do, kind of like comparative religion, history of religion stuff, fan theories, insights from all the books and the TV shows. And it's just, if you like Game of Thrones or religion and pop culture stuff, there's no reason not to get the books. They're wonderful. And the art's awesome. Anyway, I'm saying all that because, if you haven't got into Games of Thrones yet, it's a good time. Get ready before the new season launches. And check out the first half of Robert Wright and I's conversation over bloggingheads.tv. And if you enjoy this podcast, head over to trippfuller.com and enjoy me talking with. We talked 2 days in a row. That basically makes us friends, right? So now my new friend Robert Wright and I chatting it up. Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and returning to the podcast is the one and only, after a 6-year absence, Robert Wright. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Tripp. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, and we should at the front let everyone know that sometime near when this is released, there was also an episode we recorded yesterday on your podcast.
So I think
That
you
is
should give
correct.
everyone the lure over to where to find you on the internet.
Oh, absolutely. The video of that will appear on meaningoflife.tv, which is both a website and a YouTube channel. You can watch it either place. And then the podcast feed is The Wright Show, WRIGHT. That's mine. I mean, you can subscribe to the whole Meaning of Life TV podcast feed if you want, which includes people other than me. But yeah, thanks for the plug. It was a great conversation. And as cosmic as we got, I think there's new territory for us to conquer. And we may reconquer some of the territory we conquered yesterday. I don't know.
Well, and hopefully we'll conquer it in a nonviolent way.
It is in our nature. I want to emphasize that we come in peace. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a non-zero sum relationship in the podcast world.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I was going to say, just because I've mentioned it on the podcast before about the Mindful Resistance newsletter, but when you've heard me talk about it, Robert Wright's one of the founders, organizers, contributors. So for a lot of progressive Christians who have lost their biscuits, as my grandmother likes to say, over the arrival of the Orange Menace, give the invitation to the Mindful Resistance newsletter before we get cosmic and evolutionary and science discussions.
Yeah, so this started with my sense that maybe what was called the resistance was sometimes being a little too reactive for its own good, getting too emotional, responding too readily to the Orange Menace's provocations in ways that played into his hands. And also that when you spend too much time in that mode, you're not thinking about the underlying problems that actually led to his election, which I think are complicated and deep and have to do with global economics and all kinds of things. And so the idea was, let's approach the resistance more mindfully. Now, I meant that partly in the Buddhist meditation sense. I'd just written this book, Why Buddhism is True. In fact, I launched the newsletter right when the book came out about a year and a half ago, because I do think mindfulness meditation can help equip one to deal with the world with a kind of equanimity that pays off, both in terms of peace of mind and in terms of tactics and soundly executed strategy if you confront a problem like the Orange Menace. But it's not only for meditators, the newsletter. It's I also mean mindful just in the plain English sense of the term. When you approach something mindfully, you do it with care and attention, and you hope wisdom. And that's the idea. So each week at the top of the newsletter, we summarize the news as I think it kind of should be summarized. And in other words, let's don't forget about the important stuff that happened in the world while everybody else was preoccupied with Trump. Second, let's view the Trump stuff, again, with as much objectivity and equanimity as possible. We're just taking it in. And then there's a middle part of the newsletter where I write some things, and then we have a lot of background links at the end. And anyway, you can get the whole thing. You can sign up at mindfulresistance.net. We now have a little over 12,000 subscribers, and it's free. And thank you for the plug opportunity, Tripp.
Oh, no. I always get disappointed when all the plugs go at the end of a podcast. And
now that's what I did to you, except I did plug your podcast up front.
Yeah, well,
there are many other endeavors that had to wait till the end.
No, I just know that some people, I think only about 80% of the people listen to the podcast listen to near 5 minutes of the end. And I don't want the 20% who would love a newsletter and the ability to opt out of having to watch craziness on Twitter all day. They can get it all streamlined in a mindful way. So maybe a place to begin is I've said you're a public intellectual just because considering all the different fields that you've investigated, writing in at the Atlantic and all that kind of stuff, to book length pursuits, to being a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, all that kind of stuff. How do you describe yourself vocationally?
Well, first, I think if my father heard me called an intellectual, he'd roll over in his grave. So I generally, I encourage other people to use that word, but I can't quite bring myself to use it. He wouldn't mind the public part. It's funny because I came up in journalism, but I did start gravitating toward forms of journalism that involve purporting to do some original and interesting thinking, leaving aside the question of whether you succeed. I mean, I wrote, my first book was kind of straight up journalism with a little stuff added in, but it was called Three Scientists and Their Gods. And it was mainly, you are their journalism, talking to these interesting thinkers. As time went on, I wrote more of the kinds of books that an academic might write, in the sense that you're making an argument. And I actually wound up doing some teaching at the university level, even though I actually don't have a PhD, but it started when the dean of the college at Penn had read my book on evolutionary psychology and invited me to teach there. I wound up doing some teaching at Princeton, both a seminar on Buddhism and a course I co-taught with Peter Singer, graduate seminar. And then Union happened. So I've been lucky to kind of be able to indulge in an academic world where I feel pretty at home, even though I don't actually have the credentials. I've been allowed to do a little teaching, and that's been helpful in a lot of ways, including just helping me organize my thoughts. But also the contact with the students is great.
Well, you're at Union, and Reinhold Niebuhr never had a PhD, so I guess you're in good company.
I hadn't thought about that, actually. You probably know more about Niebuhr than I do, and I should be ashamed to say that, since I'm the one with the Union affiliation.
Yeah, well, you didn't have a qualifying exam on 20th century liberal Protestant theology in your PhD program, so I've probably read 1,000 pages of Niebuhr more than I wanted. Are
you a Niebuhr fan?
I like large portions of him. I'm not too. I don't know if I like the neocon appropriation of Niebuhr.
Yeah, well, he probably invited a little of it. I mean, both he and Paul Tillich, who was also at Union, were on the cover of Time magazine. And for our younger listeners, we should say that was like the acme of achievement almost. I mean, Time magazine was this institution. There were only 52 covers a year, and if you were on one of them, you'd arrive. That's interesting, both because I don't know how long it's been since a theologian was on the cover of Time. It was in some ways a different era.
Yeah.
But also because if he earned the approval of Henry Luce, who was the running Time, he had to be a little bit of a cold warrior. So what he called Christian realism, his approach to foreign policy, I think to some extent under his own guidance had a little bit of under his own influence acquired somewhat hawkish connotations. But you're right that, I mean, when in the run up to the Iraq War, I think Peter Beinart, who's a friend of mine, he was editor of the New Republic at that point, and he now apologizes for this and his whole involvement in advocating the Iraq War. But I think he wrote an influential piece invoking Niebuhr as a reason, not to put too fine a point on it, but to invade Iraq. If I'm remembering correctly. And again, Peter is, I think, doing God's work. He's, on the whole, he's a progressive Zionist who speaks out on Israel in, I think, productive ways and so on. But anyway, I digress. Stop me when I talk too long.
Oh no, I'm just saying if I was, if I was on staff at Union, I would just remind everyone that there's something you and Reinhold have in common that no one else there does, and that's demonstrating the sheer brilliance to not even need a PhD to teach at a pinnacle academic institution like Union.
Wow.
Early, I think the first book of yours I read was Moral Animal, and that was early in the evolutionary psychology kind of becoming conscious publicly. And since then, evolutionary psych has shown up in a host of different ways. But I'm interested in how it helps frame the way you investigate problems as a journalist, looking at questions around science or politics or religion. And in particular, how does it help you frame your understanding of our current moment culturally?
Yeah, well, I did write The Moral Animal in the early days of evolutionary psychology. It was barely a term almost. In fact, I didn't mention it in the book proposal because I'd never heard it. I proposed writing a book about what came to be called evolutionary psychology. There's a lot there. One thing is that I spent half the book insisting that, contrary to stereotype, Darwinism was not an inherently right-wing doctrine. It isn't the case that whatever's natural is good. There are some unfortunate natural parts of us, unfortunate parts of human nature. Doesn't mean they're not good. It doesn't mean they're good just because they're natural. And what is in some sense in our genes isn't necessarily unchangeable. And in fact, I remember the Wall Street Journal review said that I, quote, bend over backwards to find liberal teachings in evolution. I have to say I'm a little disappointed to have discovered that actually a number of people who are evolutionary psychologists are right-wing. It really has been a fairly recent development in a way that, and I don't mean necessarily far right, but there's a little bit of, I don't know if people are familiar with this thing that's being called the intellectual dark web, which purports to be purely objective. It's a constellation of people who've been written about. You can Google it. A lot of us think that they kind of do lean right on certain issues, basically, and in some ways are that. And there's been a certain amount of kind of involvement of some evolutionary psychologists in that. So as for a cultural phenomenon, I think there's still kind of a struggle for the soul of evolutionary psychology going on. I want to emphasize that it's not an inherently right-wing doctrine. And my main takeaway from it is it helps us understand the part of human nature that we urgently need to transcend. You sometimes hear now the phrase psychology of tribalism. I have some issues with the word tribalism on various grounds, but that is a huge problem. We're seeing it play out in American politics, sectarian conflict, national conflict. My main current takeaway, and this feeds into my stuff on Buddhism and meditation, is like evolutionary psychology identifies the problem with being human.
Yeah.
And it's the problem that spiritual traditions have addressed. Buddhism addressed it. The Christianity addresses it, and so on. I might add, by the way, that if you want to think about Christian doctrines that have a connection to evolutionary psychology, original sin, a certain version of original sin resonates with the view of my view of human nature. Not that we're all bad, but that, we do, in a literal sense, inherit some tendencies that are unfortunate. And, so I can see some fire and brimstone being needed. We're highly imperfect creatures.
No, well, and even around thinking about just one of my problems with a lot of progressive Christians is that they've like eliminated prayers of confession from the worship service and get uncomfortable with the word sin, which is odd given if you just know our evolutionary history, humans emerge like as biological creatures with a propensity towards violence. We survive by successfully eliminating our competitors, developing language, symbolic communication, so we can pass down more effective ways of getting our genes into the next generation. And the idea that our hardware isn't built to violence, and that even our culture doesn't encourage those type of patterns and repress our awareness of it, just seems problematic to me. And so the evolutionary psych and in a number of different ways of looking at it, I think helps us realize that the problem is not just external in the systems, as progressives we like to point at and critique. Right. It's also internal.
Right. I think in a way, when you think about it, it's amazing that there are as many good parts of human nature as there are. I mean, if you didn't know that we were products of evolution, you'd never heard of evolution. And I said, imagine a planet where life evolves by this criterion, the ones that are best at getting their, traits, genetically based traits that are best at getting those genes into the next generation are the traits that survive. You would probably imagine a species even worse than us emerging from that. But the fact is, altruism, love, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, all these things are part of human nature. The very moral sense, the idea that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that is part of human nature. The problem is, and it's a subtle problem, and it's a lot subtler than just kind of aggression and rage itself. The problem is that we are designed to convince ourselves that we are the ones who are being moral regardless of what the objective merits of our case are, and that we're designed to deploy our compassion and love in selective ways, in ways that were good for getting our genes transmitted in the past, and that A, may not be morally defensible, and B, may not bode well for the survival of the planet at this point in history. So I think both on moral grounds and practical grounds, we need to become aware of these, what are now called cognitive biases, that steer our moral thinking and our self-assessment and our assessment of others and our judgment of others. Judge not that. What's that?
Let's talk about judged. This. Yeah.
Right. And why do you worry about the mote in your brother's eye, the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a log in your own, and so on? I mean, this is very on point that the issues are that subtle. It isn't just like, hey, you're about to kill that person, that's bad. No, the issue starts earlier when people are convincing themselves and judging in ways that lead them to think it's okay for the other person to suffer. And we all do some of that, right? I mean, which of us does not have somebody who, when we hear about their misfortune, right, we go, hey, that's okay, right? I mean, people in your life, maybe people, and it isn't that there aren't people who actually do need to be punished. That's a practical necessity, but still, okay, anyway, you get the idea, right?
Yeah, well, and I think the element of or one of the elements that you gain in becoming aware of evolutionary psychology and our cognitive biases is you're able to pinpoint the habits of the mind that the mind is not wanting you to be aware of, right? Absolutely. So if we can, as a species, we can get to a place where we can approximate goodness towards those that aren't immediately ourself, our kin, and our tribe or whatnot. We can have those ideals, but unless you become aware of the way you're constructed not to do the good, you can end up, and I think a lot of people know this, people that if you relate to them are these beautiful, kind people, but the way they act in their relationships in the macro can be utterly destructive and problematic, and they don't feel the need to question those habits of the mind. Yeah,
no, I agree. And the problem is sufficiently challenging. This problem that your mind is trying to keep you from understanding the way your mind is actually working, that it takes some kind of discipline to make serious inroads on the problem, and most of the disciplines that are successful probably have the term spiritual affixed to them. Certainly, many of them. I mean, I do think meditation is one, but I think all spiritual traditions have their versions of them. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and I'll say two things about that. One is that the sermons I remember hearing, including the fire and brimstone-y ones, I mean, the very metaphor of Satan tempting you is capturing, a dynamic that's real. It's like you do this thing that feels good and innocent, and slowly you wind up in a place where you're too dependent on something or other. And so, I mean, there's wisdom embedded in all these ways, in all these traditions. But the other thing is, my mother, who was a very devout Christian, after she died, we discovered these journals she kept. And they were almost like prayers. She was asking God every day for guidance, and it caused her to reflect and say, like, I was probably too harshly judgmental on this person. So the very discipline of that was a daily spiritual practice in a particular tradition that is very different from the meditation I do now, but it had the same kind of effect of a routine that brings a kind of introspection that's healthy. And I just think that I wonder how many things there are that don't deserve the term spiritual, that are really up to the challenge. I mean, that's how stiff the challenge is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, even the idea of like thinking about temptation and stuff, today's Ash Wednesday when we're recording this, where the story that centers it is the beginning of Jesus' 40 days in the desert of temptation. And you have a practice that's built to, through Lent up to Easter to reflect on your identity as a follower of Jesus. And in Jesus in the desert, in the temptations with Satan, are three temptations that are different ways of being the Christ. He is like, do you want to bow your knee to me and be a slightly more benevolent Caesar? If you do that, you can do that. Do you want to turn rocks into food? And then you can have this kind of material power, feed the people and take over power. Do you want to get on the temple and jump down and like Silver Surfer float to the bottom and compel belief with a show of omnipotence? And Jesus rejects those, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, the temptation narrative there is like the Gospels never ask the question, is Jesus the Christ? The Gospels are asking the question, what does it mean to be it? And so many of the images of power and ways of being in the world that are perverse are the ones he explicitly rejects in the temptations, and then isn't recognized by embodying this self-giving, other welcoming, kind of justice-seeking way of being the Christ. And so, yeah, I think there are those places in each tradition. And what's interesting is how I'm interested in how in the West, you have people that don't know those exist in their own traditions and then are discovering them in Eastern traditions. Yeah. For example, like when I read Why Buddhism is True, I immediately am drawing correspondence between practices in Buddhism that do the things that are in Christianity. And then I've had minister friends of mine that were like, thanks for recommending that book. That was just so good. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, we have those too, right? Like practices that do these things. So like culturally, why do you think the interest in, appropriating another religious tradition is there?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's cool that you're doing that with a book. Thank you. And I thought immediately, first of all, of an emeritus professor at Union, Paul Knitter, who wrote a book called Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. So there is a certain amount of that actual synergy. I did a conversation on Meaning of Life TV not long ago with a guy named Michael Halloran, I think, who has a centering prayer thing in New York that he does, but he's drawing on both, Buddhism and Christianity. So there is some of that happening. I mean, it's an interesting question. Why? Well, so you're talking about people who actually are Christians and aren't realizing that the resources are there in a certain sense.
Yeah, well, and just that the West is fascinated with this secular form of Buddhism.
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, look, for a lot of people, the secular is part of the appeal. And a lot of people don't understand, by the way, that in Asia, Buddhism is an actual religion. I mean, a lot of Americans think of Buddhism as this thing that involves meditation and doesn't involve belief in gods. Well, in Asia, most Buddhists don't meditate and do believe in gods. They don't believe in an omnipotent creator God, but they do believe in gods. It's an actual religion. But I think for a lot of people, in fact, the appeal is so strong that of the secular thing, that one thing I've found is that there are a lot of there are a number of mindful venues for talking about mindfulness meditation where I'm not particularly welcome because I use the term Buddhism. So there is in America now a severing of mindfulness meditation from the word Buddhism, which I think is fine, because if you're going to get meditation into the public schools, for example, you can't be even suggesting it, that it's from some religion, especially a non-Western religion. But, so there's been, obviously there is that appeal of it to a lot of people, but these are not Christian people I'm talking about. If the secular thing per se is the appeal, although actually in a way it may be, because maybe for Christians it's attractive that they can import this without thinking that they're subscribing to another religion, and they're not necessarily. It's a technique.
Oh yeah, I have some fundamentalist family members that are very concerned about their conservative Christian friends meditating because you're turning your body into an altar for Hindu deities, and they're very worried about it. And so I think the secularization of certain Buddhist practices makes it appealing to secular people because you're getting the benefits of a tradition that's thought about how the mind works and how to create a healthy relationship with it. And for Christians who are so Protestant that they think religion's primarily what you assent to on a series of beliefs, and if you're a good citizen and employee, then that it's secular means you get a benefit of an actual spiritual tradition that's helping shape your psyche and relationship to the world without admitting you're, engaging in another religious tradition.
Right.
But I feel like that phenomena connects to what people mean by spiritual but not religious. Is it Protestantism, especially one that valued being culture dominant as throughout the Enlightenment, has slowly deflated all of its spiritual wisdom and practices to be compliant. And now religion has more to do with politics and more to do with tribal identity than tradition, rituals, myths that help shape the interiority of the persons that participate. And so
that's interesting. So what kinds of things do you find yourself prescribing that you think are most lacking in terms of, well, what do you find works with, maybe especially young people, what kinds of things do you suggest in the way of spiritual discipline, ritual, whatever, that wind up resonating?
Well, when so in mainline Protestantism, usually your confirmation class is the last time your parents force you to go to church. Mm-hmm. And so when I was a minister that facilitated it, I moved the age back to 16 so that you don't do it until you can get pregnant and drive a car. Which, because it's supposed to be you choosing to be an adult participant in the tradition. And we would go on an opening 4-day retreat, like on a long weekend, where they have no technology and you do centering prayer twice a day. And by the end of it, you can do 30 minutes twice, which is just a liberating experience if you're detoxing from the need for attention. And over the course of the retreat, I tell them, look, this is you deciding to be an adult member of this wisdom tradition. And to really understand the tradition, you have to understand the practices. And honestly, we're a UCC church, congregational church. If this isn't what you want to do right now, I will go to your parents and tell them that it's immoral for them to coerce you into doing it. And you can do confirmation again next time or whatever. And we read the Sermon on the Mount 3 times over the weekend. And then I say, what is the most offensive part to it? And I'm basically trying to talk them out of becoming Christians using Jesus, right? So the whole logic is, adolescents deconstruct their world and they resist the ideologies they're handed. And I think, late modern capitalism with all the nationalistic problems that are going on, all the tribal issues, the threat for the environment, that Jesus deconstructs the worst parts of our tyrannical power better than most. But I'm like, so if you're going to do confirmation this year, you can decide at the end of the retreat. And most of them will say yes. And they they agree in the covenant of the group to do it. And I have a giant glass bowl called the Big God Bowl questions, and I never answer them the entire year. So every week they have to come up with a good theological question about the tradition. They put it in the bowl, and I always run over on time and never answer their belief questions. But the week is reading the narratives of Jesus, and then we come up with month-long experiments in truth. Like I told you yesterday about not judging. Sometimes Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, when you fast, when you give, and when you love. And the assumption is disciples do it. Most of them have never fasted. So we, for a month, fasted from screens, unless you had to, write
That's tough.
Homework. That's tough. If you have all of a sudden have a group of friends fasting from screens, then it's what do you take up in the space that you're fasting from? And it was handwriting letters to people that have blessed you. Well, if after a month of handwriting letters, you've cultivated such a sense of gratitude for all those that have blessed you, because you wrote one every day. And you're hearing back from people with this genuine connection that when you re-engage with technology and screens and things, you realize what it's doing to you, raising your anxiety, and the sheer gift of people created in the image of God around you that you're ignoring. And so, like, my goal was always, what are the practices that Jesus invites his community into, and what is it like to do them in our context? And when you do it, does that experience of being human seem more true to who you are? And does that community resonate with the deepest parts of yourself? And if you had asked a bunch of those students what they believe about God, half of them are going to say whatever evangelicals think, because that's what is culturally assumed. The other half are going to say, well, I'm probably an atheist. But I think the debate around beliefs in religion is just so depressing and so uninformed. That's the worst place to start. But like learning to pray for your enemies, forgiving without counting, not judging, cultivating a deep sense of gratitude, all those things make life much more beautiful. And when you're in a community that does that, the idea that the source of the universe could be no less than personal and desire good for all is more believable. But so that's kind of been my my response to it, and that's actually why I love the lecture you did around the new agnosticism, because I think it's intentionally leaving open a space where you can enjoy, benefit, and exist within the richness of a particular tradition without really needing to sign on a dotted line or know in some ultimate or final sense or have clarity about particular beliefs. And to recognize, like, there's a certain sense of wonder and awe to being human that if we relate to the world in a flat and kind of reductive way, we're missing out on. And I'm more invested in helping people be human than convincing them to be Christian.
Well, that sounds like a great thing. I mean, I think, the world of screens has increased the value of retreats. I mean, it's funny. I went on my first silent meditation retreat in 2003, and it wasn't like an issue. There were no smartphones. I mean, I guess I owned a cell phone, but it wasn't like an issue. You left it aside. I didn't have any contact with the world. That was understood to be part of the 7-day experience. But now it's like divorcing yourself. I mean, you put your email on auto reply because you're not going to be, and then you got to put your smartphone somewhere. And it's like, it's very hard for some people. But if you do it, it makes the retreat even more valuable, I think, than it would have been in 2003 because of what you are escaping, the kind of oppressive, addictive world of social media and so on. Not that that's all bad, but obviously it can exert a grip that's unhealthy. I also thought when you were talking about what you do with these kids, I wish that I had more to offer my children in the way of ritual. First of all, I was brought up Southern Baptist, not a real ritual heavy environment. There was no confirmation for us. I mean, you do make the decision to be baptized if you do, which I did when I was pretty young in retrospect, like 9. But
you got to get it before the age of accountability, Bob. Once your sins can be held against you for eternal conscious torment purposes, you got to get them kids down the aisle.
Well, it's funny, what did it? This was during a revival, a summer revival where they would bring in an evangelist.
Oh, yeah.
This guy's name was Homer Martinez. He's well known. I was once talking to Bill Moyers about this. He said, Homer Martinez, famous evangelist in Texas and thereabouts.
Well, Bill Moyers is a wet Baptist. That's that Baptists that drink in public and liberal Baptists. They're an endangered species.
I guess my father drank the occasion. Well, he was in the military, so you can understand how he came to drink the occasional beer. But when my Aunt Lorene, his sister, the hardcore Baptist, visited, He hid the beer. He didn't want her to know that he was drinking beer.
I know. I got some fundamentalist in-laws.
Yeah. So, in the end, I decided not to drink myself. So I actually, oddly, was brought up Southern Baptist and don't drink, even though I did for a while. But so some of it I hung on to. But wait a second, where were we? Anyway, ritual and kids. I wish, because I didn't bring them up in any. We did the Unitarian thing for a while, and actually, I'm going to have coffee with the local Unitarian minister later today. But we kind of fell away from that. As you've no doubt heard, there is with Unitarianism, there is the problem of just, how much there is to grab you, whether it hasn't become so, too, in a sense, I don't know, theologically sterile, whatever you want to say. And so that didn't stick. Anyway, I think it's good to have things like rites of passage for kids.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have much of that, and my kids had even less. And I'm kind of sorry about that.
Well, do you think like the walk you did with your daughter across the country, something like that will become a rite of passage in the family where, she'll walk with her children, that kind of thing?
Well, there is actually, interestingly, a thing we do. There is that. She's amazing. She got this grant. She graduated from college a couple of years ago, got a grant that allowed her to walk across the country interviewing people, and then turning the interviews into what's called found poetry or something, editing what they said down into kind of poetic form. But I walked with her roughly from St. Louis, Missouri to Columbia, Missouri, which was a little over a week. And that was amazing. That was completely amazing. Wonderful experience. I'm so glad I did that. But also, we actually have an annual summer walk. We go to a place in the summer that has a lighthouse, and the walk is, it's a couple of miles in the sand, so you really remember it. And that's a family ritual that has a kind of virtue that I've made so we've been doing that for close to 20 years. But so there are things you can do, but I envy, in a way, conventionally religious people for having a more of a structure in that way.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is how to describe a religious tradition when you're in a non-competitive way. I think that most people hear religious traditions as they're necessarily competitive, and they're so if that's not how you see religious traditions or the God you experience and encounter in them, which I honestly don't think it should be that hard, that when you're told to pray for your enemies and not, bear false witness, that Christian traditions would value their particularity without demanding consent. But anyway, I think that one of the challenges in our contemporary context is how to understand a religious tradition as a wisdom tradition. And I sometimes worry about how, as a species, we will do when for intellectual reasons, religious pluralism reasons, cosmological reasons, aware of kind of social and historical accidents that shape you and put you in a particular tradition, and then all the way just down to that we're aware of false consciousness in ways species weren't before, that we end up losing the wisdom in all of the historic religious traditions that was part of our evolution as a species. That you talk about in the evolution of God, that if we get to a place where individuals don't have the benefit of that deep well of reservoir, how many generations will run well without them? And maybe religions were providing something that the religions themselves may not have been conscious of, but that humans need. Because each person's born at kind of stage one of psychological, moral, spiritual development. And in a religious tradition, you can see the stages throughout it growing. But in a congregation, in a community, tradition, and rituals, you can invite people to a healthy expression of where they are and invite them to get deeper in it. And I wonder how to celebrate that that's what we do, as opposed to, think that we're really rallying around a triune formula that almost every participant in your church will sound heretical if you ask them.
You mean celebrate the various things that different religions have brought to the table?
Yeah, well, and to say like the Christian tradition is its particularities, its uniquenesses form a very specific wisdom tradition. But when you're in that community, it gives you rituals, history, stories, liturgical practices to help form your interiority, to cultivate your sense of altruism, to expand the network in which you're invested in with graciousness and justice and all that kind of thing. And that's what religions do. Now, what percentage of what you talk about when you talk about God coheres to ultimate reality? Well, I don't know if we're ready to settle that.
Right.
But if we get rid of those traditions, we're getting rid of the places you learn the stories that you later deconstruct, then you come back to with a new naivete that you then wrestle with at different transition points and all that kind of stuff.
Right. No, I definitely see your point. I mean, there is an accumulation around the world under the rubric spiritual tradition of what is wisdom. And, that's parts of the Old Testament are called the wisdom, the part of the wisdom literature. Proverbs, the thing that Paul says, we mentioned this yesterday, the thing that Paul says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him and so on. That's also found in Proverbs, as Paul knew. There has been this accumulation in the various traditions. And I mean, this isn't exactly what you're saying, but I rarely, I don't know if I could have a conversation with somebody like you without eventually getting around to complaining about the new atheists, but it's like for them, to quibble about like whether, as you put it, a particular conception of God corresponds to ultimate reality, even if they think the conception is way, way off base. It's like, who cares? The question is, what kind of behavior does it inspire? And it seems to me, given the fact that it's very clear, I think any reasonable person, just on the basis of philosophy and where philosophy and science are, has to acknowledge there are things we don't have a clue about. What is consciousness? And things like that, given the fact that we just don't have a clue on the basis of objective observation about what the nature of something you could call ultimate reality is, like, shouldn't you focus on the much more urgent question of what kinds of behaviors religions are inspiring? Now, I know, of course, the new atheist, part of their critique is this extremely confused idea that they can point to a whole religion, namely Islam, and condemn it on the grounds of the kinds of behavior it inspires, which of course shows that they're focusing on a very small subset of Muslims. But it just, the Ethical Culture Society has this motto, deed, not creed, and that's, a big hobby horse of mine is the ultimate test to me of a spiritual tradition is what kind of behavior do you see it inspire among various people? And you're right to point out that there are certain commonalities in the kinds of behaviors that it, at least in some cases, inspires in the various traditions. One more not totally unrelated point. It occurred to me for the first time when you said, pray for your enemies. Now in Buddhism, one way to encounter your feelings about your enemies is through meditation. There is a kind of meditation called metta meditation. That's a Pali word that means loving kindness. And in loving kindness meditation, you systematically go through imagining different kinds of people, and ultimately you imagine an actual enemy and try to wish good things for them. And part of mindfulness meditation generically and inherently to some extent, a part of this loving kindness meditation is to really observe carefully and confront the feelings that different kinds of people arouse in you. Like when you think of an enemy, you get a certain kind of feeling. If you observe it mindfully, that can be a way of disempowering it, a way of letting you decide whether you want to be enslaved to it, whether you want to be guided by it, or you want to transcend it, okay? And it just occurred to me for the first time that it's actually very hard to pray for an enemy without going through what is in some ways the same exercise, right? I mean, if you sit down and pray for an enemy, you're going to run into the fact that you have a feeling that makes that hard, right? I don't see how you can not wind up observing that feeling and having to come to terms with it one way or another. So it's just an example of the little ways that it isn't just that, you see common ethical strictures and great traditions, but ultimately they've all had to grapple with the same parts of human psychology in trying to realize their ethical ideals. And so you find some degree of commonality in the mechanics. And we haven't even started to talk, we haven't even talked about the specifically mystical traditions in right. the Abrahamic religions, but I just think there are all kinds of little connections like this.
Mm-hmm. So how would you contrast the new agnosticism, or Bobism, as you called it, the lecture, with like the older versions of agnosticism and the new atheists, like in the not necessarily located in a tradition? How do you see the new agnosticism?
Well, first, if more than one person subscribed to my spiritual worldview, I'd quit calling it Bobism. But I look forward eagerly to that day. But I gave these lectures at Union, 4 or 5, under the rubric "The New Agnosticism," and they're available online if you Google it. So what was I up to? Is that what you're asking, or?
Yeah, because the way, at least the way I understood you framing it, is that the new agnosticism is actually more humble than older agnosticism, in thinking about just the universe and scientifically and how it relates to ultimate reality, and also that humility is resisting the finality in a lot of the popular atheisms.
Yeah, so people forget that. I mean, they don't forget, they never knew it. But so the word agnosticism was coined by Thomas Huxley, who was a contemporary of Darwin's and a friend of Darwin's and a fellow Darwinian. And he said, he used the term, I think, agnosticism is a kind of profession of humility. It's like you just don't know, and you shouldn't say you know things unless you know them. And he said, to say that you know that God doesn't exist is an unwarranted belief because you can't prove it, basically. That was the idea. So it's just a profession of humility. You don't know, and you don't feel you have grounds for knowing. And what I said, one thing I said in the lectures was the grounds for humility have actually gotten stronger since then. In other words, the reasons to not jump to the conclusion that there's no God or that there's no larger purpose unfolding in the universe, the grounds to resist jumping to the, atheist in the strongest sense stance have gotten stronger because science has shown the world to be weirder than we imagined since Huxley lived. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's quantum physics, which, by the way, among the things it says is there are things that happen in the universe that are not caused by anything in the universe. That is the mainstream interpretation of quantum physics by physicists, is that things happen, these random events. When you ask, when this particle decays, is it going to be heads or tails, so to speak? Mainstream view in physics is there's nothing in the universe determining which outcome it is. They would say it's truly random. Now, I had a conversation with Brian Greene, the famous physicist, and if you Google this, it has a very interesting moment. I've done 2 video conversations with Brian Greene on meaningoflife.tv. This is the one that's not at Union. This is just we're both sitting in our offices. But I pointed out to him, and I'm just kind of playing, speculative games. I'm not really trying to argue for any scenario in particular, but I was pointing out to him that this view in quantum physics is a loophole in potentially for an interventionist God. You can imagine a way an interventionist God could use the loophole to exert non-random influence on the world. Again, that's just a little game I'm playing to point out how unfinished our conception of what's going on in the universe is. And he basically, you can judge for yourself, but I think he kind of conceded the point and said, oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, that's one example. Quantum physics in various ways makes us think, whoa, the world is weirder than we thought. There are various different interpretations of it, kind of one weirder than the next. And then I think that the phenomenon of conscience, sentience, the fact that it's like something to be alive, that we have subjective experience, I think, ironically, the development of neuroscience and the ability to do brain scans and show that, hey, when you're feeling like this thing's going on in your brain. Ironically, I think people are finally realizing that what that does, that body of science does, is to actually underscore the mystery of consciousness. And I think the kind of Dan Dennett view that, Consciousness Explained was the title of his book. The joke among some philosophers is it should have been Consciousness Explained Away. In any event, his view I don't think is prevalent in philosophy, and I think has been losing ground. And I think the number of so-called Mysterians, that is the people who just profess they can't really figure out what this consciousness thing is, exactly what its relationship to the material world is, I think the number of Mysterians has grown. But anyway, my larger theme was that, if anything, since Huxley said that an appropriately intellectual, humble person does not assert with complete confidence that there's no higher purpose, no God, the grounds for saying that have actually gotten stronger because of science and because of the evolution of philosophy in concert with the development of science.
Yeah. And you talked about how religions have cosmologies, and almost big philosophers that do kind of big picture stuff have one. And one of the things that has come up in a number of interviews you've done is how big history, if we talk about it that way, which the telling the narrative from quantum fluctuation in a vacuum for 13.8 billion years has this kind of necessarily narrowed perspective, in that it's always looking at objective reality. And one of the things that Hott brought up, John Hott in the interview that you did, and who else was it? Oh man, now I can't remember. But was that when you tell that big picture, you end up narrating it, and the way you tell the history of the cosmos, once you put a narrative in there, it starts to lead to raising questions of meaning and purpose and such. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you did in that lecture series is raise the question of purpose. So thinking, not from a religious tradition where there's an experiential and contextual place in which you read the story, how does the question of purpose come up when looking at cosmology?
Yeah. I've made the argument, and this has gotten me into trouble with I've done this to the shock and dismay of a lot of the friends I made when I wrote my book about evolutionary psychology, the kind of hardcore Darwinians. But I've argued that I think evolution by natural selection has some of the hallmarks of a purposive system, by which I don't mean anything spooky going on necessarily. I mean, just if you take the standard Darwinian account, it's a physical material system unfolding in accordance with the laws, with physical laws, as ultimately reflected in this fact that the genes are selectively transmitted to future generations and all the implications of that. Even if you take the view that it's just a material system and natural selection works as Darwin described, you can still make the case that if you look at the broad sweep of it, like from original self-replicating material to the development ultimately, it crosses various thresholds of complexity. You get complex cells, you get multicellular life. Some of these things are invented multiple times. Multicellular life has been invented about 10 times, suggesting that there's a potent kind of evolutionary logic behind crossing some of these thresholds of complexity. Anyway, eventually you get something that's a species with a sufficiently complex brain to launch what we call cultural evolution, kind of in the anthropological sense, meaning everything from religious ideas to science to technology. And that becomes a kind of So, I mean, you see a kind of direction in the first place, not in the sense that all species become super complex, but in the sense that the most complex species there is over time tends to get more complex and smarter.
Right.
And you eventually get one as smart as us, and we launch cultural evolution. It exhibits some of the same tendencies in the sense that it carries human social structure to more and more complex levels, from hunter-gatherer village to the verge of globalization, to the verge of a global community. I've just argued that if you look at that system unfolding, and you stipulate that it's just a material system unfolding in Darwinian ways, it looks like something that's headed somewhere, possibly by design, not in the sense of intelligent design, again, but it raises the question of whether it is not unfolding in accordance with some purpose. Now, what or who might have infused it with purpose? Could have been extraterrestrials who said, hey, let's set these molecules off of replicating, and we have an idea of what kind of thing's going to happen just by virtue of the situation. Could be a god, could be a deistic god. The algorithm could have been implicit in the Big Bang. It could be not even, there are ways you can imagine it not even being an intelligent being that set it in motion. I mean, after all, animals, in a sense, develop with purposes, even by Darwinian accounts, that is to transmit their genes, and they grow and get more complex. But Darwinians would say they were, quote, designed just by a process, not an intelligent being. I know I just covered a lot of ground. I'm just answering your question in the affirmative. Yeah. I have said, I believe that there's reason to suspect that maybe this whole thing is headed somewhere, in some sense manifesting the unfolding of a purpose, which becomes all the more interesting when you realize where we are, which is at a point where, it seems to me, either we form this global community, which I believe will entail moral progress toward moral enlightenment on the part of all of us, or super bad things happen. So, I mean, if indeed we've been, evolution has naturally tended toward this point, which is almost like the climax of a good novel with moral stakes and everything.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's food for thought. It's something worth talking about, and it's not crazy.
That in a sense, we are now aware that as a species, we are in a web of interdependence with all living things on this planet, and that comes with ethical challenges. And if you look at the history of humanity, we have been challenged multiple times to figure out how to expand our kinship, kind of the structure of altruism, in a sense. Mm-hmm. And now it needs to include not just people across the world, but life itself on the planet. Not like I'm sure we can't eliminate all life, but anything that is complex and near ours.
Yeah, I'm not losing too much sleep over this thing they're thinking about doing, rendering mosquitoes sterile in Africa. I mean, maybe it could have bad implications, but that particular actually, that is worth worrying. It's a genetic engineering technique that they need to think very carefully about deploying. But anyway, I take your point. I mean, I mentioned that I taught a course with Peter Singer. Well, two things. Of course, he wrote a book called Animal Liberation, which was a founding text of the animal rights movement. Mm-hmm. But also he wrote a book called The Expanding Circle.
Yeah,
which was right after the kind of precursor of evolutionary psychology, sociobiology came out. He wrote this book talking about the fact that, okay, we have this equipment for altruism directed both within the family and at least, selectively and reciprocally toward non-kin. And then somehow we have harnessed this in the service of moral enlightenment. And the title Expanding Circle in his book refers to the fact that, like, 2,500 years ago, members of one Greek city-state considered members of another Greek city-state subhuman. Then they came to think, well, all Greeks are human. And now today, most of us would say, well, all humans deserve decent treatment unless they've done something horrible. And there is such a thing as universal human rights. And Peter was just saying, this is amazing. We take it for granted now that it's really frowned on to talk as if members of one ethnic group don't have equal rights. But he's saying, believe me, the world wasn't always like this. We have seen an expansion of the moral circle. And of course, Peter is a very strong advocate of expanding it to include animals. But the main point is there's been progress. We should take hope. We should find grounds for optimism in that. But there is, I think we face a real challenge for starters, just in dealing with our fellow human beings in ways that don't get us to blow each other up.
Yeah.
But ultimately, on moral grounds alone, I think our concern for the welfare of sentient beings should include animals.
Mm-hmm. So when I was thinking about that lecture series, one of the in our conversation yesterday, something popped in my mind. You said something in it like, if we find out that there's a purpose in the universe, who would have been more accurate, a simple theist or an atheist scientist? And then
right.
It's not the easiest question to answer, right?
Like, no, exactly. I mean, that's my point is like, so for reasons I just described, and I could go into greater depth and make more in the way of a rigorous argument for actually suspecting even, not just holding out the possibility of evolution representing the unfolding of a purpose, but actually suspecting as much, thinking that maybe it has a 50% chance or better being the case. I could do that argument, but leaving that aside, my point is it's a real possibility. It could turn out, and we could learn someday that it was in fact the case, that in some sense there was a larger purpose unfolding in this universe. And I just said, if that's the case, who would you say was closer to being right? Like new atheists who are asserting confidently that there is no higher purpose, or people who had a specific theological scenario that might turn out to be wrong in various senses, crude in various senses, but did entail the notion that there is a purpose unfolding. Who would you say was closer to being right on this fundamental issue? I think you can make the case that there is, in this sense, a very real prospect that someday you'll say, well, whatever you think of the specifics of the Christian story or the Muslim story or any other story, they were closer to the truth than the new atheists because it turned out there was a purpose. And I'm just, it gets back to the fact that I think more humility is in order on the part of certain new atheists like Sam Harris than we have seen.
Mm-hmm. So when so the question that came up, and this is, I don't really know how you'll answer, so this is why I want to ask it, is if you take the question around consciousness, and if it's not ultimately something that is, at least if it's not ontologically reducible to the material universe, then wouldn't the question of consciousness make your position easily a panentheistic one, as opposed to something more like a deist one, where the machine itself has a purpose and its trajectory and how it's kind of fine-tuned to evolve and such? But if there is an interiority to the big story and to the participants in it, or if mind emerges at some point where it can respond to something other than just its material conditions, but to the presence of mind at the level of culture, the presence of spirit or whatever, then if there is an inside story, the cosmological picture you're describing would cohere with a type of panentheistic vision.
Yeah, well, I mean, you, of course, know more about theology than I do, and I only have a kind of fuzzy notion of panentheism, the idea that the natural world is in some sense within the mind of God or something, as we kind of said yesterday. But but when you say interiority, I have a little more of a sense of what you mean. I mean, I think of Teilhard de Chardin, and I think of kind of John Haught's worldview, and the idea. Well, let me just say this, and I'll hope it's relevant. We are so far from having a clue as to what this whole subjective experience thing is about, why it is like something to be alive. And I mean, again, I hate to keep plugging my stuff, but I did a conversation recently with a really excellent philosopher, Gideon Rose, head of the philosophy department at Princeton. And we talked about, if you Google that we get into why I think there's no escape from the weirdness of consciousness. It just poses a challenge for scientific materialism that's really hard to grapple with. Anyway, we are so far from understanding what's going on there that there's just a lot of scenarios that you have to not rule out, I would say. And I want to repeat another thing I said to you yesterday. Like, I have this thing with one of my two dogs. He comes up after breakfast every day, scratches on the door. I open the door. I sit down in the big chair in my office. He jumps up and he looks at me and like he wants to be petted. But this is a dog who will sustain eye contact for like forever. And as I said to you yesterday, you don't do that with people. It's too awkward. But with a dog, you can like just stare into their eyes. And sometimes I have this, I think, it's like, I'm obviously, I'm like feeling love, and I'm thinking, it's not impossible that like what fundamentally is going on here is some kind of attractive force on the interior part. Mm-hmm. And the material world is accommodating itself to that. Now, I'm kind of hoping that none of my Darwinian friends listen to your podcast at this point, but in case they are, I want to emphasize that, in other words, this is like an Eastern, kind of it's kind of a Vedanta, I suspect, worldview of, where consciousness is fundamental and the material world is secondary. Mm-hmm. And I'm just saying there are times when I don't entirely rule that out. I want to say in this scenario, it would still be the case that natural selection is an accurate account of what is going on in the material world. It would just be that in ways we don't understand, the mechanics are themselves subordinate to something else. And I don't think we can rule that out. And again, I don't know enough about theology to know how directly that relates to the question you're asking. But certainly I am suggesting that we can't rule out scenarios that are somewhat different than the most meat and potatoes kind of deism where it's just you winding up a clock, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, one of the reasons to engage in these conversations is one, there are lots of religious people who don't need to dismiss science and interact with it. Two, there's lots of people that contact me that find the podcast who, grew up secular or atheist, who then have religious experiences they're trying to make sense of, but are a practicing scientist or whatever. And also, like, I've recently been doing a series on religion and science. I've interviewed 3 or 4, physicists who are very committed to their religious tradition, and see no inherent conflict. And my theological questions, like the type you're asking, they're like, yeah, I just don't think I've ever had to worry about that. So like but I do think the sheer mystery of life and the universe and the awe and gratitude that can be cultivated in it is mm-hmm. something where finality and closure when it goes to ideas that are attempting to wrestle with science and the diversity of human life is I'm just allergic to it. And I think that in the academy, the dominant worldview is one that is either embarrassed if you have religious commitments or mm-hmm. convictions, and is too compliant with a type of utilitarian and research for profit motive thing that we're dehumanitizing the academy, and that's a problem. And I think it's connected to having a world that you only look at using efficient reason and where you take a kind of neoliberal flattening to everything and assess it, that it leaves out a lot of the most amazing parts of being human, and people repress experiences and available options. And that's one of the reasons I love a lot of your work, because it's not like you're coming from a particular tradition or a commitment. You just keep asking questions and getting frustrated when they tell you this is how it is, And you're like, but that's not a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, the title of my last book, I have to admit, may not sound like it's consistent with that description. It's called Why Buddhism is True. But I want to emphasize, it's not as obnoxious. I don't mean it as obnoxiously as it sounds. And I'm talking about the quote secular and naturalistic parts of it. I'm saying their account of why we suffer and how we can alleviate suffering is right. But also some of the metaphysical ideas, which an interesting question for you is, I doubt that many of them are incompatible with a Christian worldview. I'm just thinking about this for the first time. There's a couple of very challenging ideas. Well, not self, you might have trouble with. The idea that self doesn't exist.
Well, so the one thing I would say, and you get to hang out at Union, so you can ask the follow-up questions to, like, John Tatominal would be a good one to ask, that in Alfred North Whitehead, he differentiates God and creativity.
Yeah.
And so God is he calls ultimate actual, or John Cobb uses the language ultimate actuality, and creativity is ultimate reality. So creativity is that which all things participate in, and none thing instantiates, where you get like the no self doctrine. And enlightenment is cultivating it is cultivating through practices the release from the ego and identification with the present and such. God is in process thought is invested in luring in each moment at the level of mind to the greatest intense experience of beauty, complexity, justice, and such. And so enlightenment is about creativity and such, and salvation is about the transformation of the material order to more beautiful, sustainable, creative, complex relationships. And so seeking salvation is different than enlightenment, but they aren't competitive. Right. One of the problems has been that Western philosophers of religion define religion based on Western experiences of religion, and then tell everyone they're all doing religion. And so every religion's going up the same mountain. And so it's like, all of you are equally wrong, but what we mean by religion is pretty much Christianity for intellectuals.
Yeah.
And then as you get to the top, each religious tradition gets closer together, and it's in a giant fog of mysticism. But that picture of religion in process thought is being critiqued just to go the way the world is organized. There's not the Eastern traditions have cultivated traditions of the mind and practices that attune oneself to creativity. The Western traditions have been more responsive to, the more social salvation by material transformation.
That's interesting. There is, I should say, the Buddhist doctrine of not self has as its ethical extension selflessness in the moral sense. The two are related. An interesting thing about Buddhism is the way the metaphysics have ethical implications. And that's an example where certainly you could see Buddhism and Christianity as on the same wavelength in terms of the ethical implications of the not self doctrine. But yeah, the climbing the mountain thing is an interesting metaphor. And I don't know how you feel about the whole perennial philosophy thing. That's related. I don't know. You're a skeptic of perennialism.
No. I do think that. One of the things perennial, I wouldn't enjoy the details of it as much as the observation that religious traditions over time cultivate beliefs, practices that they then turn on themselves. And in doing so, the religious traditions actually become engines of social and moral progress in ways that they weren't initially. And you can see it. And that, to me, would say that, if you're, thinking philosophically about a God, that God relates to us in the context that we're in, not in an arbitrary place. So God only has to work with what was there before. And so in a non-interventionist, coercive, omnipotent deity, God lures based on the context. And so it doesn't make sense to so each religious tradition is the fruit of God's self-investment or Spirit's self-investment in that tradition, that context, that history, and it's always a dynamic relationship. So I would hate to put all the religions on one mountain. I would think they're different ones, and they cultivate their own histories because the context is different. In Western traditions, it makes more sense that science emerges out of a monotheistic context. And, there are lots of historians that talk about that. But a lot of the scientific language around laws and stuff is basically theology about the natural, early natural theology. So to me, there's the perennial philosophy is an observation that, should God operate at the level of mind, traditions get better at being responsive because they actually have a history of response. Yeah. In the same way you could think about biological life, if you're, under the same way that over time, the complexity emerges, and you see breakthroughs. But I guess the other way would be like when you talk about how, multicellular organisms emerged multiple times. The kind of religious tradition in that it turns in its beliefs and ideas on itself for the transformation material order has emerged separately. And now the traditions are bringing wisdom together, having learned from.
Yeah, that suggests that there were certain ideas that were kind of in the cards, so to speak. You certainly see this in technology, independent discovery of ideas in technology. And in all these cases, it's reason to suggest that they were fairly likely outcomes when there are certain, whether it's ethical ideas that originate independently and spread in separate contexts and flourish or whatever, for what that's worth. I think that's an interesting fact. By the way, the I guess chief articulator of the perennial philosophy, or at least I think the term was Aldous Huxley, right? The son of Thomas, the son of the aforementioned Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnosticism.
Yeah, have you ever interviewed Simon Conway Morris?
I have not. He reviewed my book Non-Zero for the New York Times Book Review. I've met him. I should actually try to get him. I haven't checked in with him in a long time. At last check, he's a paleontologist, right? And he shared my critique of Stephen Jay Gould's paleontology. We both thought that Gould gave short shrift to the directional nature of evolution. But then I know that Simon Conway Morris, I gather, is a Christian, and it was never clear to me, does he believe that there's also intervention or what? I don't know what his worldview is there.
Oh, well, not intervention, but I would think, non-interventionist participation.
Yeah.
And when you talked about like multicellular organisms evolving.
He emphasizes that, I know. He emphasizes like the same
like the eye. Right. Yeah, things like that. And, which, one of the things I found with religious people, if they're conservative, is if you ask them theological questions about our planet, it creeps them out. You ask them about aliens, and it's a lot easier for them to think about it. So,
well, the other thing is all the talk about the simulation, right? It's all these people who would get super upset if you said they were getting theological, are like, yeah, I think we're probably living in a simulation. There was this super intelligent, super powerful being who created the world we're living in, can intervene. Well, that sounds, I don't understand exactly what the difference between that and certain theologies is, but I think it's good that all the simulation talk has kind of legitimized cosmic speculation of a kind that should be legitimate.
Yeah. Now I know you, I think you're supposed to go soon. I don't want to keep talking.
I do have to go so I can do a series of things that will permit me to be on time when I meet the aforementioned Unitarian minister I'm meeting this afternoon.
Yeah, and just, I won't tell you, but I'll secretly will just be praying that your heart will be joyfully warmed and
okay, well,
when you interact with the minister.
You mean that I'm so the Unitarian chilliness doesn't invade my soul?
Oh, no. It's just a baby step back to your Southern Baptist existence.
You think so? So you're hoping that he'll be the first step toward my showing up at the door of your church?
Oh,
Do you have a church?
Now I teach a lot of places. I mean, my wife and I are both ordained, but we're members of a church, but I don't work at one. Surprisingly, when you put all your ideas on the internet,
nobody wants you to be their pastor.
There are less churches that say, yeah, they're like, we really like you. We want you to come speak at our church, but we don't need all your opinions Googleable.
We think the average congregant would be able to find at least one thing you've said on the internet that they are not enthusiastic about.
Yeah, and in the movie The Road to Edmond I made, my character, of course, I'm acting, but in breaking a series of taboos with the youth minister who's having existential crisis because he got fired for being welcoming to gay members, I rip Leviticus 18 out of his travel Bible and roll a joint with it. And
I can imagine that certainly there were some churches of my youth that would not have welcomed you after seeing that scene.
Yeah. But the other way of putting it is, there's only one minister in America who has created a movie with the line "Puff, puff, pass Leviticus" in it. And you too could receive communion from him.
That is a legacy to be proud of. And if it means you can't find a job, so be it. Life's full of trade-offs.
Yes. Yeah. There are all sorts of trade-offs. But I really appreciate you, us getting to talk back-to-back days.
No,
so I might be in withdrawal tomorrow.
It's my pleasure. I hope I've gotten you to say more things that'll get you into trouble than you've gotten me to say that'll get me into trouble, but I'm not optimistic. Come to think of it, we'll see.
All righty. Thanks
a lot, Tripp. This was great.
It was fun.